It's June 1920, and it's the time for the trial of Ronald Light for the murder of Bella. We're walking down through an ancient part of Leicester, the Church of St Mary di Castro, which dates back to 1107. Nearby is the original site of the Leicester Castle, and this area is also linked to Richard III, the famous king, died at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, and he's now buried in Leicester Cathedral, so it's an area associated with King Richard. But we're coming down here because it was the site of the Leicester Castle Court, and this is the building that Ronald Light is going to be tried. Now, of course, we're talking about the days when Britain had capital punishment. There were 24 executions for murder in 1920. Is Ronald Light going to be the 25th? Seems fairly certain that if found guilty, he will be sentenced to be hanged, because the brutal murder of a young woman, particularly again on the back of all the tragedies of the Great War, he cannot expect to find any mercy from the courts. The jury would have been an all-male jury then. Women juries only came in later. Possibly, I think without doubt, some men on the jury either would have served in the Great War, or if not, they would certainly have relatives that had served there. So is there a degree of sympathy for this ex-officer and ex-soldier who suffered from mental problems, potentially, in their minds? The prosecution's case is really all based on circumstantial evidence. But there's quite a bit of that when you look at it. Light had been identified as being the stranger that had accompanied Bella to Galby. He'd been identified as having been the man who had got the green bicycle. A bicycle repairer had identified him as being in his shop in the previous days before the Saturday, and even on the Saturday saying that he was going to take a ride into the country. He'd been in the army as an officer, so it was very likely that he'd had a revolver. The type of cartridges found in the service holster pulled up from the canal were exactly the same as the bullet that had been found near Bella. So this is pretty strong circumstantial evidence. However, they could not come up with a motive. Why would this man, having met this woman for the first time, want to shoot her dead? She hadn't been sexually assaulted, her clothes were all intact, etc. She hadn't been robbed, she got very little money on her anyway. What was the possible reason or motive that he would want to kill her? Prosecution claimed that he had taken a different route back. He'd cycled ahead of her, cut through the village at Little Stretton, which we can also see subsequently on the video, and had waited for her at the gateway and then proceeded to shoot her. They pointed to the fact that he'd done everything to try and hide his identity by throwing away the bicycle, removing the identifying marks, throwing away the revolver holster and the unspent bullets into the canal, and that was a deliberate attempt to conceal physical evidence linking him to the murder. Furthermore, when he'd been arrested, he'd basically told conflicting stories that conflicted with solid evidence, such as the ownership of the bike. The prosecution also had two younger girls, aged 14 and 12, who also testified that before these events, some hours before, they'd encountered Light as they rode their bicycles, and they'd had an encounter with them. Having said that, they'd only identified him after having seen his picture in the papers, so there were some doubts presented about their evidence, I believe. The revolver, or the service pistol, was never ever found. It had never been recovered from the canal, possibly still down there in the mud to this day. Ronald Light's mother, who lived at the Highfield Street address in Leicester, had retained the services of Sir Edward Marshall Hall, the most renowned defence lawyer of his day. He was involved in many prominent high-profile cases, but he later stated that this case was the most difficult that he'd been identified with. Now, the defence took on really two forms. First, Ronald Light had agreed with Marshall Hall that he would testify on his own defence, so he took the stand. Basically, under cross-examination, he accepted most of the witness statements. He accepted that he was the person that had accompanied Bella to her uncle's house in Galby. He was the person with the green bicycle. He had owned a service holster and cartridges, and he had disposed of the bicycle and the cartridges and holster. However, the one crucial fact was that he hadn't killed her. He'd got no reason to kill this young woman who he'd only recently met. He'd left her at the crossroads and cycled back on the Stoughton Road and then to Leicester. And Bella had turned off on the Burton Overy Road and eventually the Gartree Road, where she was found by the gate. Now, on the maps that I've shown previously, they're marked as upper and lower roads. That's how the jury were described to them during the case, and they were shown maps of the area. So why had he then not come forward? Why had he not simply come forward and said, yes, I met this girl, but I'd left her? And why had he disposed of the bike and the other evidence? Well, his answer to that was basically, if you like, human nature to a certain extent, that he panicked. He thought people would add two and two together and make five, and basically that discretion was the better part of valour. And Sir Edward Marshall Hall made some comments, I believe, that although he may be a moral coward, that didn't turn him into a murderer. Light denied having the revolver at the time. He accepted that during the war he had been issued with a service revolver. And it's a fair point to make here that during the First World War they weren't just the exclusive use for officers. Other servicemen such as tank crewmen and pilots and machine gunners were also offered pistols. So there were a vast number, I think something like 300,000 Webleys were manufactured during its manufacturing period. He basically said that he left the holster at home, and when he returned to France he took the revolver with him. And when he became a casualty and was moved to the casualty clearance station, that's where it was left. Now, that might seem a bit of a questionable statement. Why would you leave the holster and take the pistol with you? But that's what he was implying, that he actually didn't have the revolver with him in Leicester at the time of Bella's death. Apparently he was calm and collected during over 5 hours of cross-examination and didn't contradict himself during that period. Now, Marshall Hall also tried to bring in some other factors. One of the macabre aspects of the case was that a dead crow had been found in the field next to the gate with the claw marks and blood on the gate. And one of Marshall Hall's theories was that somebody had been out shooting and accidentally killed the girl. Medical evidence showed that she'd been shot from approximately 6 or 7 feet away, though. His other claim, because he was a bit of a gun expert himself, was that given the caliber of the weapon, the wound she had endured would have been far worse. She had a small entry wound under her left eye, and she did have an exit wound in the back of her head, but according to Hall, nowhere near the size it would have been, having been hit by this very large caliber bullet. And again, we need to perhaps spend a little bit of time looking at that subsequently, about the possible explanations for that. Another incident was the doctor on the autopsy. The original doctor had removed a piece of skin from Bella where the bullet hole was, and he subsequently brought that up during the trial. And Marshall Hall again was trying to show that it was a very small entry wound for the potential caliber of the weapon. Another theory was it a ricochet from a long distance bullet? There was a local Leicester gunsmith that was used during the trial, and he was trying to basically contradict some of the points that he'd made. So the trial goes on, the evidence is heard, and in time the jury are dismissed to decide their verdict. They go out and deliberate, and after 3 hours they come back. One time I think the judge called them back, saying if they needed another evening in the hotel to become brought back the next day, and this foreman said that he thought they were close to reaching a decision, and they came back in. There was a sort of theory at the time in capital cases where somebody was going to be hung, that if the jury looked at the defendant, that was a good sign that they were going to clear them. If they looked away, perhaps at their own feet or away in the jury, that was not a very good sign for the defendant. So the jury come back in, and apparently they do look away. But when the foreman is asked the verdict, it's not guilty. So Light is acquitted of the murder and he's free to go. So what did happen on the evening of the 5th of July 1919? Well, I think possibly even then there was only 2 people that knew, now both long gone. But we can look at some of the points again, and can we raise some possible solutions? And we can revisit some of the sites. Again, if a young woman is found shot dead next to a gate, You could put that into three separate potential causes: suicide, accident, or murder. Now we can, I think everybody would agree, completely dispose of the suicide notion. Obviously no gun was found next to the victim. She had been shot from 6 or 7 feet away due to the medical evidence, so she obviously hadn't shot herself. And not least of all, of course, there was absolutely no reason to commit suicide. So we're really looking at, was it a murder or was it an accident? If it was a murder, was it actually by light or somebody else? And if it was an accident, was it by light or somebody else? And again, from my personal perspective, when I look at this, and let me say again, I'm nowhere near a criminologist, a forensic person. I have no background at all in criminal investigation. I'm purely a local person who's interested in this case, just a member of the public who I find this case quite interesting because it's local to where I live. But I think when you look at the case, there's what it could be, what's possible, and lots of things are possible, but what is probable, and what, based upon your life experiences, would you say is probable in this case? One of the first aspects to me is where she was found. She was found next to a gate. Now, even today, a gate on a road is a natural stopping place. It's a place where you stop to let the kids out the car, let the dog out the car, have a cup of tea, read a map, etc. Especially on a small country road where there's not much room to pass. If you're out, you generally are going to stop at a gate. So I think there's a reason she was at that gate. That's one of the points. I think she was shot with a service revolver. Although there was doubts put about that, the probability of another weapon killing her when the bullet is found very, very close to her seems highly unlikely. And the bullet that was found was a .455 service pistol bullet. And obviously subsequently, service holster and cartridges of exactly the same were found in the canal. So it seems highly, highly likely that was the bullet that had killed Bella. That bearing in mind, we'll have a look on the accidents theory in a minute of the type of weapon and how they operate. So back to the murder theory. She hadn't been sexually assaulted. She obviously hadn't been robbed. Why would she have been murdered? By anybody, including Light. I've been out on the anniversary on the 5th of July at exactly the same time as the farmer found a body, and I was out some nights previously exactly around that time, and even today on one of those occasions for about 20 minutes or so there wasn't one car passed, let alone a cyclist. So the probability of other people being exactly in the same area 100 years ago seems even more remote. Given also the time of when she left Galby to when she was found, which was quite a short period of time really, possibly 30 minutes, did somebody else come along and kill Bella? Well, of course, it's possible, but is it probable? It seems to me much more likely that the person that was trialled for her was the person responsible for her death. But was that by murder or accident? I think it's much more likely it was by accident. Perhaps he'd seen this young woman out before, and perhaps he wanted an excuse to meet her. There is the question of why would he be carrying a heavy revolver? Even in these more dangerous times today, you don't feel the need, not that you're allowed to in England anyway, but you wouldn't feel the need to go out on a bike ride near Little Stretton carrying a pistol. So why was he even carrying a pistol, and why hadn't that even been seen? He was wearing fairly light clothes, he was wearing a suit, he did have a raincoat, but why was it that that pistol hadn't been seen even by Bella or by her relatives in Galby? It's a big, heavy device designed to go into a holster. It's not what the Americans would call today a concealed carry weapon. Having said that, most people had saddlebags to keep their puncture repair kits and things like that in, so maybe he could have been placed in a saddlebag. Apparently, there is a note from a police superintendent, and it's part of the exhibition in the De Montfort University Heritage Centre at the moment, that after the trial was over, when Light came to collect his goods, he did subsequently confess to killing Bella by accident. His explanation was that he was going to show her how to shoot the pistol, and somehow that had gone off, killed her dead straight away, and he thought, obviously in a panic, he thought discretion was a better part of valor, and just hoped that nobody would be able to identify him. And when we look at the service pistol, or the particular type, that sort of makes sense to me. Now let's take a look at the type of weapon that was possibly used to kill Bella, remembering again that no pistol was ever found. Webley and Scott had been providing service pistols to the British Army since the late 1880s. By the time the First World War came along in 1914, they were on their Mark V version, and in 1915 introduced the Mark VI, which is now seen to be the quintessential British service revolver. Very reliable weapon in a heavy calibre of .455, designed during the colonial period to be able to stop a charging tribesman. The Webley is a break action revolver, and it loads 6 cartridges. It's also what is known as a double action revolver, meaning that you can fire the gun in 2 ways. You can pull the hammer all the way back and take an aimed shot, or you can just pull the trigger all the way back and it will fire. When the hammer is pulled all the way back, it's a lighter trigger pull. You don't need so much pressure on the trigger, and therefore it's more capable of taking an aimed shot. But if you've got this tribesman charging down at you, only a matter of feet away, and you need to fire quickly, then just being able to pull the trigger, you can fire the gun rapidly, say 6 times. That's why these particular types of guns don't need separate safeties. If it's left in double action mode, it's very unlikely you can accidentally pull the trigger. Having said that, as Light said, maybe he was pulling the gun out to show Bella, maybe he cocked it into single action, and then, depending on the weapon involved, a light pull on the trigger by him, or even as he handed it to her, maybe it went off. Is there another possibility that as he pulled it out from his coat, or wherever he kept it, it fell onto the hard surface and the hammer struck the ground, again firing the pistol and killing Bella? Perhaps you can decide if that's a more likely scenario than he actually deliberately shot her. So what about the other accident scenario? Well, when people are out shooting crows or rabbits today and then, they generally go out with a shotgun, not a pistol. Seems unlikely that somebody else just happened to be in that same area at the same time shooting a .455 revolver and accidentally killed Bella and even less likely that they wouldn't have known that and should have come forward. Seems highly unlikely to me. What about the situation of the calibre size that Marshall Hall was trying to show that a cartridge this size would have done far more damage to Bella? Well, there's two possible explanations for that. One can just be that bullets do not always seem to operate in the way that we always expect. Secondly, during the First World War, because of the amount of training involved on the Webley, a second device was introduced that fitted into the barrel and the chamber, so you could fire a much smaller cartridge at .22. That way people could get used to aiming the gun without the bigger recoil of the .455. Perhaps there was a cost issue as well, although given the cost of the First World War, I don't think that was really the issue. I think it was more a training issue. So was it that Light's revolver was actually either made in .22, or was it that he had a device in the gun? That could possibly explain the type of wound. But again, we have to remember that a bullet was found only a few feet from her. Not a cartridge, but a bullet. So all in all, I still believe personally that Light's confession is true, that he did shoot her accidentally on that evening. So we are returning to where the story really started, in the village of Stoughton and the churchyard of St Mary's. Bella's funeral was held on the 11th of July 1919, and it was attended by thousands of people. The vicar actually made the comment that he hoped everybody was there out of sympathy for Bella and her family and not out of idle curiosity. However, of course, again, this was not very long after all the tragedy of the First World War, and I'm sure many people were there in sympathy. 15,000 men in Leicestershire lost their lives during the Great War. And when we look at the village of Great Glen nearby and the War Memorial, which exists in every city, town and village in the United Kingdom, we can see there are actually 40 names related to the Great War. Ronald Light died on the 15th of May 1975 at the age of 89. And if Bella had lived to be the same age, she would have died in 1987. Not that, perhaps long ago, depending on the age of the people watching this video. But whether it was by malice or by accident, her life was taken from her. And she missed all the subsequent years, perhaps marrying a sailor boyfriend, having children, all the Christmases, all the summers that were denied her. Of course, she might have been denied some of the tragedies of life as well, because if they had married and had children in the 1920s, by the time the Second World War came along, if they'd have been boys, then no doubt they would have been in the service of their country. And when we look at the memorial in Great Glen, there's a further 9 names on there from the Second World War, including 2 by the name of Cross, who died in the service of the RAF, and I guess they were related, perhaps brothers. But it is a sad end to a young life. So if you've gain some interest on this story. As I said, there's far more you can do to get more information about the case by the books involved or the current exhibition in Leicester. Perhaps you need more information before you can make your mind up what really happened that day in the summer of 1919. So, we'll leave some roses for an English rose. Memory of Bella.